You're live. We're live. We're not live.
We're live.
We're live. Is there anything coming on there?
It will.
Okay, so I'm sure this is going to take some time to figure out for us. So our first live stream. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. To nobody. Nobody's here.
Whether you're here or whether you tune in later, that's a-okay. It's tough to schedule your life around a live event. Yeah. So if anyone tumbles in, I will keep an eye on the chat, but otherwise we'll just kind of continue.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Gord.
And I'm Charles.
Yeah, so we're doing the Ganky Comics thing. Welcome to all the new subscribers that joined us in the past couple of weeks here. Yeah, so our live stream today is about KATE Beaton's Ducks.
And welcome to Michelle in the chat.
Yeah, hey Michelle. Ducks by KATE Beaton, published by Drawn and Quarterly. Just came out in 2022. Yeah, just feeling like it's a really important book. I get the sense that it is a fairly popular book right now. Lots of copies of it at sort of the mainstream booksellers. And there's a lot of hype, a lot of talk about it. And, rightfully so. I think KATE Beaton has got an awesome track record here with some of the other books that she's done. And she did get that New York Times #1 best-selling author label. I think as a result of...
From Hark of Vagrant. Yeah.
Here's her other book,
sort of the first collection. Now I noticed that we are mirrored. We are mirrored.
Oh yeah. Let
me see if I can sort that out.
Sure.
If I can figure out where it is that I would do that. Cancel. Growing pains, folks.
Okay.
We're working it out. May not be able to figure. We might have to go off and then come back on live to make it non-mirrored.
Are you okay with it like this?
Yeah,
I'm
totally
okay.
fine.
Yeah, okay. Let's just keep going.
Just know that if you hold anything up, it's going to
it's gonna read backwards. Right.
What if I had a bright light, I could shine it through the back of it.
I got my light box.
Now we will just continue on and not rely on holding anything up that way.
So the subtitle there is 2 years in the oil sands. So essentially what's going on here is KATE Beaton spent some time in Alberta's oil sands up in northern Alberta between 2005 roughly to 2007, I think it was. There was a break in there.
Sort of that tail end of 05, I think, and then into 08 eventually between the two stints.
Yeah.
That she did.
So it's kind of a personal book for me, like growing up in these parts and having life being impacted by what's going on in the tar sands. So, I kind of took a keen interest in it. And also to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which is a really classic book about labor and how people are treated in their workplaces. And I would say probably the preeminent book that does that. Mm-hmm. And kind of felt elements of that with Ducks. Kind of a similar thing, right? Upton Sinclair, when he did The Jungle, he kind of snuck into this meatpacking plant and reported what he saw there. The big difference between that and KATE Beaton here is that when he came out of the meat packing plants, the stuff that he saw, that he wrote down, nobody believed it. So it had to be published as a work of fiction. But I don't think anybody's saying that about KATE Beaton.
Well, but similarly, you hear a lot of stories, living in southern Alberta, we all kind of just through the environment wherein you tend to know somebody who works on the rigs or knows somebody or a family member who works in the rigs or works up in Fort Mac. And so you hear the stories, but they keep it pretty buttoned down. They very successfully sort of kept what arguably should be a pretty loud element of people talking about down to just a murmur.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to see a work like, before Ducks came out, probably the closest thing I could think of in popular media that showed what life is like in Fort McMurray would be the what's the Giver guys, the Terry and Dean.
Oh, Fubar.
Fubar 2
Yeah,
is
that's
probably
right.
the closest
Yeah,
look
yeah.
you get to what life is like for someone
That's
working
right.
in the oil sands. And in Fort Mac, and the sort of some of the lunacy that happens around that, especially when you look at things like, sort of like social disobedience and drug use and alcohol abuse and the treatment of workers. In popular media, not much gets out from
No,
there.
heck no. And I think you know it as well as I do, that it's a very personal experience being up there, and KATE BEATON talks about that. But on top of it, we also have a bit of a propaganda arm here in Alberta around this stuff.
Government-sponsored
Yeah,
propaganda.
government-sponsored stuff that's going to prevent word getting out about some of these things. And KATE BEATON kind of talks a little bit about some, like, the stuff that she's saying is being discredited as she's sharing with people. But before we go any further, I should hazard that there's spoilers bound.
Yes, we're going to be treating this truly in a book club style. So with the assumption that you have digested the book, or just digested enough of it to be talking openly about everything that's in there content-wise.
Yeah.
So be aware of that if you have not read it, we will be talking full spoilers.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So KATE BEATON is from Cape Breton, which is way over on the other side of the country from us.
Pretty much as far as you can get.
Yeah, definitely. Like, yeah, isn't it? She mentions that in the
Basically,
book. It's like the
basically you're on the
Canada.
eastern tip of Canada.
Yeah, and she comes out to Alberta to work on our very famous oil sands.
Yeah.
And
found like a lot of people are, saddled with debt from school and trying to figure out how to get your life started and not be saddled with that debt in a way that blankets your entire existence. She figures the best way to do that is to buckle down, work in Fort Mac, because of course the stories going back east from the people who work out here are that keep your head down, you're going to make lots of money, don't be stupid with it, and you can do well. And she figures that that's the best way forward for herself.
Yeah, and then throughout the whole book, there's that tension that she has about, like, where her belonging is and where home is, and people in the book are telling her, "Oh, you know what? Just like forfeit any ideas you have about going back to where you live, which is home. You're here now." And the sooner you just admit that to yourself, the easier this is going to be.
And that's a common thing with Alberta, I would say. Yeah. So a lot of us, even, not in trades or not in, heavy machinery or oil production, often come to, you're from Alberta originally, but I came from southern Saskatchewan. And that was sort of a common narrative as you were growing up and getting towards adolescence and adulthood, was you're going to go to Alberta. Yeah. It's almost this foregone conclusion that you're going to probably find yourself in Alberta because that's where the opportunity is. And then once you got here, people would kind of talk in that same way. Like, the sooner you just stop fighting it and become an Albertan, the better. And in some small way, that's kind of true. The sooner that I became comfortable in this place and said I'm going to make the best of it and make a life here, the better it was for me personally. Now I was facing a very different sort of ordeal than KATE BEATON was. Right. Life in Calgary, I would argue, is a lot less strain and disorder and chaos than it is up north.
Yeah, so a key element in this whole narrative that she puts together is loneliness and isolation.
Yeah.
And really, I think that's the experience of a lot of people living in Alberta now. And you hear it, whether it's from somebody from Saskatchewan or or out east, or even further across the world, is that you come to Alberta and you're very isolated here.
Yeah, and I'm sure like we both do some work in the educational fields, and I hear that from students
All the time.
constantly,
All the
especially newcomers to Canada, or talk about how isolating it is and how it impacts everything. So from their social life to their education to everything.
Yeah.
So that's such a common thing in Alberta, is that feeling of isolation, what it can do to you.
Absolutely. And I think right now in particular, it's part of the reason is here. Like, it's cold ass outside. It's a really cold ass. It's minus 45 degrees Celsius apparently, which I don't know. Do you know what that is in Fahrenheit?
About the same. Minus 40 and minus 40 is where it lines up. Is where it lines up. So with our wind and the elements, it's as if it's minus 40 out there.
It's really cold.
It's very cold.
So the difference between here and Fort Mac is, we've got a lot more to do here, obviously in the big city. But yeah, it's cold. It's cold. People are inside, very isolated. And I think that's a big piece of Canadian culture overall. It's just contending with the elements, and that creates some isolation.
Yeah,
so we tend to generate a lot of creativity
and being expected to just simply persevere.
Yeah, just push through. But yeah, definitely a lot of differences. She is living in a rural, very isolated part of the province, and while our whole province does have rich sources of oil throughout, there's a high concentration of it up in northern Alberta, particularly in northeast Alberta, a bit in northwest Alberta. I did live in Grand Prairie for some time, which is fairly comparable to Fort Mac, but I think Fort Mac is more like a Mos Eisley Cantina kind of situation up there.
Yes. Yeah.
Just people coming, who lives there, nobody's really sure. Yeah.
And northern Alberta has a history of that very thing. So a lot of cities and towns, and then and turning into cities that are built solely around the trade that is happening there. And so we saw that a lot with when mining in Alberta was large. There were all these mining towns that were very prosperous up north. And the second that mine closes, that place bottoms out. It becomes a full-on ghost town. And Fort Mac would probably be that way without the oil sands there. I couldn't see it being, even existing.
And there's a lot of people, just to put it in context here in Alberta too, is that people will drive around with bumper stickers that say, "I love Alberta oil and gas," or "I love Canadian oil and gas." Like, it really is a big part of the fabric of living in these parts.
Yeah.
But if you want to just jump into our discussion questions.
We sure can.
Yeah.
Remember, it's going to be backwards.
All right.
So we'll just read them off.
Yeah, we'll read them off to you.
So we'll start with the first one there.
So what surprises did you experience in reading Ducks, and why did those things surprise you?
Sure.
Yeah. You go ahead.
You want me to start?
Yeah, you start.
So one thing I found, because this book, it delves into very serious, like triggering. So also trigger warning with everything here. There's full-on discussions about depression, isolation, sexual assault,
substance abuse,
misogyny.
It's all there.
Full gamut.
It's all there.
So you can imagine, we've been talking a lot about isolation. It's doubly so when you're in that northern community, locked there essentially, because there's really nowhere to go from there, and to be there as a woman as well, a young woman, when Kate was there. One thing I found particularly surprising for me is how even-handed Kate tries to be with her portrayal of it. This could have been a pretty it's very I'm sure tempting to go full on that it was all terrible, but she talks about the good and the bad, the people who brightened her days as well as the people who darkened them, and is very careful to say in the closing chapters of the book how it was really a small minority of those who made the time bad, who did the worst things against her and other people. So that I found surprising, to try to be as even-handed as that. I'm sure sometimes, not to put words in Kate's mouth, but I'm sure there's always, I know even when we're creating a work, we think about, okay, how will this be received? What could be the possible pushback, and how do we head that off at the pass? And be mindful of that. And I'm sure those thoughts, when you put out anything, especially in Alberta and in Canada as a whole, that is critical of the oil and gas industry, the pushback can be immense. The pushback can be can be and go far beyond the pale in terms of that idea of a response that's one for what they get. No, it comes back 10 times as full of vitriol and spite.
Hardcore.
So I think Kate was smart to do it that way, and also shows her own maturity and her own like the way she masterfully tells a story and knows how to do it in a way that shows some balance. But overall, I was surprised to see it done so even-handedly.
So I wonder why you were anticipating that it was going to be kind of this. She was going to reach into the tar sands and just rip at the sinew and like throw it everywhere. She's
more so that I didn't expect the closing chapters of the book to really make what I felt to be a really knowing statement, almost turning to the audience in a fourth wall breaking way and saying, just to remind you, this is a very small set of people. And we often complain in Alberta that when we see problems with oil and gas or our policing or our government, that we're often told, hey, it's just a few small, it's bad eggs. It's just some bad apples. Just a few bad apples. And everything else is fine. Nothing is systemic here. Nothing. And to see her handle it in that sort of way as well, you go, it was surprising me to see her sort of turn to the camera and say, hey, this, I do really want to say that there were good people there, and it was a small subset of people who were doing the bad things. That was surprising for me, because when I look at how the government goes to bat for the industry at all levels, when I see the way that the industry themselves often muzzle those who want to criticize it, it is systemic. It's a failure at all levels of industry, the corporate community and government and our society as a whole, to allow it to exist in the way that it does, and be this predator style, this predator prey mentality that exists there. So in that way, that's how it surprised me. Is I was surprised to see it that balanced, when really the conversation that's been being had in a larger context is how everything is so systemic.
It was a pretty humanistic perspective, I think, that she took.
As a
result of that.
And I'm not saying right or wrong. Just I was very interested to see that that's the path that the storytelling took.
Well, it reflects a compassion on her part for the people that she was up there with and having to experience the same things that she was experiencing. And it's a systemic thing as opposed to any one individual being an asshole or whatever. Super refreshing, because like online, it's so black and white when people are talking about this stuff, right? So like I can see why you anticipated that, because really that's what we're surrounded by anytime you see Alberta Oil Sands mentioned in any Reddit, any thread. You're gonna get that the really pushback. Black or white kind of look at it.
It becomes that you're either with us or you're against us. A mentality often comes about, instead of seeing it in those levels of gray of where do we need to improve? How can people's lives be improved? How's quality of life?
There was a few things that surprised me. So one is how well she illustrated sort of the social order of Canada. She articulated it very well, very casually, without a whole lot of judgment there. She's graduating with this arts degree and trying to figure out like what she's going to do with her life, and recognizing that this arts degree comes with a pretty significant amount of debt, and her feeling that her only option is to go someplace where she can get some quick money. And in Canada, that's the Alberta Oil Sands, right? So, you know, in Alberta, it's a very transient population overall because, you know, historically we've taken people in from Newfoundland, a lot of people from the Maritimes where economic opportunity is really poor.
Especially once the fisheries.
Yeah, once the fisheries
dried up.
Yeah, forget it. And so really, like, there's not a whole lot of options for this. You could probably go to the territories and go into the mines up there.
Yeah,
to mine for diamonds, but
yeah. If you find yourself in that sort of rock and hard place,
what options are
what do you do? Like, other than like, do you try and do a stint with the Canadian Armed Forces?
Yeah.
Or you know, go up and do ranger work up in the north?
Yeah.
Where you know you might get paid a little more. Yeah. Otherwise, what do you do, especially when you're looking to go outside your own field of study?
Totally.
You go into the trades.
Totally.
Yeah, you go into something where you can be taught on the job.
Yeah. And she doesn't get into it too much about like the local perspective on all of what's happening around her. There's that one guy that kind of confronts her as like, if you got a problem with it, what the hell are you doing here kind of perspective, which really is indicative of what I would expect her to experience.
Yeah.
But just for myself in context with this, like I remember my high school teachers, they just seemed defeated and discouraged because so many kids were dropping out to go work in the oil sands. Like, you didn't need a high school diploma to make a ton of cash.
Yeah, making six figures with a grade 8.
Yeah, and we had guys dropping out, and I even had teachers telling me to do that, which was really odd thing to hear. Your teachers telling you, yeah, hey, maybe you want to do this, but I think it's because of that disillusionment. It's like, what's the point of what I'm doing here if we're just leaking kids to this industry? So really, like, I don't think it's too much different, Kate, if you watch this. I don't think it's too different. Like, we kind of come at it with a similar experience as well. And a lot of friends that I grew up with had the same thing. It's like, you're from Alberta. That doesn't necessarily mean anything, because you're gonna be saddled with the same challenges, like that insurmountable debt.
Yeah.
What do I do with that? How do I give myself that foot forward? It's like, well, post-secondary was that answer, or at least we thought it was, until we had that tremendous amount of debt. What did we do with it? I was paying off my student debt for a long ass time. Yeah. Yep. I think I might even still paying some of it off. I'm not sure. That was one thing that surprised me, and she did it so well, and I was really impressed with that. Another thing that surprised me in this book was, and I've heard it from people who come to Alberta before as well, and it always surprises me, is illustrating how wild it is here, and like kind of giving that impression that it's really, really wild here. And like, she does that, and she kind of gives you that impression through these beautiful landscapes that she illustrates throughout. But at the beginning of the book, she's seeing signs of like a bear crossing. Let me see if I can even find it. I might be able to grab it. The bear crossing is one thing that she takes note of. Then there's this fox that, little fox that she kind of befriends, and she's like, get the hell out of here. And then, of course, the namesake of the book, ducks, right? Like this wild environment that she's sort of found herself in. I've never seen Alberta that way, but I've definitely had people say that to me, like newcomers from other parts of the world. Some people even say, like, I don't want to leave Calgary because it's just way too wild out there. Like, I'm going to see a bear and it's going to eat me.
You think about people who've never really seen a wild, especially if they come from an urban environment in another part of the world. They come here and they've never seen really an animal that isn't an urban animal.
Yeah.
And to venture outside the city and you have deer crossing the highway, it can be mind blowing for people. Or seeing, a fox or a coyote or something, and then especially if you start seeing something large, you see a wolf or you see a bear, that puts the fear in you.
Scary. Yeah, we saw a pair of cougars last summer.
Yeah, that's too scary. That's too scary for me.
Yeah, it's pretty. I mean, we were in the car; we were totally safe. But yeah,
you think you're safe.
But that's part of it too. I didn't feel scared, I guess, like in that situation. I don't feel scared, but maybe that's because of my social construction. It's like we don't.
It's an expectation that you'll see a wild animal.
But then I think of like Cape Breton. When I think Newfoundland, I think, holy, that's got to be a wild, wild place. So for her to say that she's coming to this wild place. And also in context with that wildness of it, it being just a young place too, and it almost feels like a Wild West in this book.
Yeah, especially when you go up north, it is very much so. The whole mentality and everything changes.
Yeah, like there's laws up there, and there's definitely police up there, but
the lens in which they see it through is very different.
Yeah, and I think made for maybe some bad things to happen. Totally, some bad things to happen. I feel like there was one more surprise I had a note.
I'll bring up mine first while you're checking your notes.
Yeah, you got
the one other thing that surprised me about is how the namesake for the book were ducks. The idea of the ducks and the tailings ponds that happen in the north, so that the ducks dying in the tailings pond and their sort of band-aid fix that's government approved is just fire off a shot every time it senses a bird. It comes so late in the book.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be more of a through line through the book.
Right.
And it comes up in those last couple chapters, this idea of it and the sort of throwaway nature of it, which really was the right way to do it, I think, because it culminates, because Kate goes through so much throughout the book, and then she comes across some revelations as she's getting towards the end, because she starts having her family members coming as well, and she's scared for them, and she's worried about having thrown her own kin to the wolves, so to speak. And so the through line between that and the tailings ponds and the ducks kind of intermixed, and the sort of fragility of things and how you kind of are being thrown to danger, really culminating together at the end of the book was the right way to do it. But I was very surprised not to hear anything about tailings ponds or ducks
throughout the whole thing
until the very end of the book.
She was so delicate with all of that, like throughout the book, as she's raising some issues that she's running into. It's like I'm thinking to myself, I can remember that headline, or I can remember this headline.
Absolutely.
And in the Ducks headline, it was huge news here.
Yeah.
And
it actually opened a lot of people's eyes to issues of the oil sands.
Yeah.
Where it was this sort of thing that was very underground before that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of the first whiff that the outside world is getting privy to what's going on up in northern Alberta. Crazy cool stuff. The name of the book, that metaphor of ducks, and the way that you're talking about the ducks and the tailings ponds, these ducks are coming in sort of towards the end of this thing. That ducks as the metaphor for women up in the tar sands, up in the oil sands. And it's kind of the same thing. It really is the same thing. Like it's such a beautiful metaphor that she uses there. And the fact that you talk about her family and her bringing her family over to come work in the oil sands. It's worth noting that it's all sisters, and she's bringing her sisters up there to experience what she's experienced. But it really does sort of raise the stakes and raise the danger of it.
Well, and you see her wrestling with that, because her one sister comes just sort of as she is exiting for a time, And so she goes, I can't even be here to protect you. And then
yeah,
that tension and there's that, you know, the feelings of regret, and like she might be betraying her, you know, leaving them to a dangerous situation. Like you see her really wrestle with it, and it's heartrending. Like it really makes you feel sick for her, for that whole situation. It's
man, that makes me appreciate this book even more. I think, like, you know, you and I have been talking a lot about Die Hard and the qualities of storytelling in Die Hard, and really evaluating it, because Charles recently did a little 8-page Die Hard in 8 pages, and it was beautifully done. And it's such a good little exercise into how to tell a good story with very limited real estate.
Yeah, how to adapt something to its core.
Yeah,
you know, distilling it down to its essentials.
And one of the things that you talked about that made me appreciate that work is like, okay, well, if you remove this character, how can you keep the stakes high with removing that particular character
and all the threads that are attached to them?
Yeah, they did that well. And yeah, it makes me appreciate that with Kate's work here. It's like every one of her sisters is pretty essential to this story, and essential to the impact that this has. So huge kudos to Kate for that. That's
and the way that Kate introduces the characters of each major section of the book that you're going to be seeing was so well done, because it could very quickly, you know, you're very quickly getting to Shakespearean levels of cast.
Yeah.
And the way that she handles that and keeps that, and it's part of her rendering style as well. She does things in such a nice, clean, gestural style that it was very easy to keep
super immersive, right? So so she begins each chapter with these beautiful landscapes
to give you an idea of the setting.
Real industrial in the middle of nowhere, just kind of plop there out of the sky. And then each chapter starts with a cast of characters, right? These little drawings.
And done, like when I see that, I that's when I see that sort of thing, I say Kate could write a book.
Yeah.
This is the same thing that an author does with the first half to 2 pages of a chapter or of a section of a book, setting up both the atmosphere of the environment and the cast that you're going to be dealing with.
Yeah.
And she uses those same sensibilities.
Yeah.
So smart.
Yeah, very smart. Using the comic book language to its full potential in here. And like you could write a novel about this, and I'm sure those books exist, and those like nonfiction critiques of the oil sands. Nothing's gonna hit as hard as this, though. Like graphic,
when you see it in
that
in a visual medium,
accessibility is so important to what she's talking about here. Awesome. Okay, well, let's jump to the next question. Are you good?
Yeah, I'm all good.
How would you categorize this book in a library? Do you know the Dewey Decimal System? I sure as hell don't. How would you categorize this book on Amazon? Or
well, it's interesting because when you first pitched this question, you know, we were brainstorming questions. I was going, that's a question you can answer in just a few words. And then I started thinking about it and going, oh, but you think about how the visual medium is often treated in a library setting or thing that where it's often shunted to the side. Because I was going, oh, well, easy. I'd put this into nonfiction Alberta, like nonfiction and Alberta topics.
Yeah.
But then I was going, oh, wait a second. It would often get shunted over to the graphic novel section, which tends to be the two or four shelves at the end of the library, way on the other side. I'm like, this thing needs to be up front and center. This is also trending events or current events, because this is
environmental events,
environmentalism. It's also about Canadian identity and Canadian topics. It's also
feminism.
Yeah.
It's a feminist piece of literature. Absolutely.
So suddenly this question of how would you categorize this book, I was going, oh geez,
she touches on so many themes and handles them with equal care that it's just this question I thought was maybe impossible.
It really is. It's one of those things where I started looking at it and saying, my my IQ's not high enough to actually because and I would say actually when we talk about systemic things, I would say a library is not equipped to put this where it needs to be, because no single one place is where it needs to be, other than, you know what, it needs to have a stand up pop up thing when you first walk in. It has to be, especially right now when I think it has the potential for the most impact, should be put in front of people as much as possible. And it defies categorization.
When I picked it up, it was in the graphic novel section of the big box bookstore, and it was in the graphic novel section, and which is great. And I think booksellers are getting better at handling this stuff, but still, like, it gets mixed in with like hundreds of Marvel superhero titles. So you've got Ducks on the shelf right next to like Infinity Gauntlet.
Yeah, so it occupies that same space between, next to a, Thor swinging his hammer around.
Yeah, the only thing they have in common is that it's a visual medium.
Yeah.
Or do we start comparing this to Infinity Gauntlet?
I don't know.
I don't think we can. Seriously, nothing in common. It's not even a love story.
It's such a different,
So nothing in common. And if you're going to classify this as like, Alberta history or Alberta nonfiction, it's like, well, you might as well just to this book, because it's not going to go anywhere.
This is the kind of book that I think has a potential of breaking out of that idea. It's such sort of a gatekeeper type dichotomy that exists between prose and graphic fiction, or nonfiction in this case, and I think booksellers, especially seeing the response that this book is getting, I'm hoping are starting to figure out that, like, hey, this deserves to be on that premier, that luxury spot at the front of the store, that your newest Stephen King or what have you, your biggest book of the month, this should also be in that same, discussed in those same terms, even though they go about their storytelling in a visual manner versus purely prose. They're peers, and I'd like to see that distinction erode further.
Yeah. I wonder if she's got some classification in here. Sometimes these, I think with the US, don't they have to proclaim like how it fits into the?
Occasionally, it tells you how it's like classified, but I'm not sure in this case that it would.
Yeah. No, I'm not seeing anything here about that.
Yeah, it's a book that deserves to be front and center. I think especially right now, where the discussions that are happening in our society at large tie into what's happening here so much, and it should be there.
Yeah.
Now, is that going to be the case? Not always. Like you said,
I don't think so.
You found it.
I'm just off. But also too, I'm seeking out stuff like this, right? I don't know if somebody's going to necessarily just discover it, which is that's not anything about KATE Beaton's Ducks necessarily. It's something about the medium as a whole, right? Like it really does just sort of get kicked into to that sort of catch-all graphic novel section, or young reader with the graphic novel section there. As I seek this stuff out, it's frustrating for me. Do I look in the Westerns? Because this particular graphic novel is a Western. So do I look in the Westerns to find that? Probably not. And I have to go to the graphic novel section, but I can't find it there. Is it somewhere else? It's so hard.
Yeah, and it becomes that question of like, well, how do they treat it here? How do they look at this kind of medium in this place I'm in? Yeah. Would they put that in with the prose stuff? I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah, it becomes a very impossible thing. I'm hoping that as things progress, and as especially you look at younger people, I think they're more exposed to all these mediums. I'm hoping that sort of gatekeepery aspect will erode further, and it'll become more of a a pool that everybody gets to swim in.
Yeah.
Is that going to be the case? I don't know.
I hope so.
I look even at our generation, who are getting a little long in the tooth now. We grew up with more access to visual stuff, but it still didn't really change. You were expected, you grow up and you start reading books, and you put those comic books to the side.
Right. We're still breaking out.
But I think it takes works like Ducks to really show people the huge potential in the graphic medium, in the visual medium, to tell these sorts of stories, where this could have very easily been a prose book, and I think it would be less powerful as a prose book than it is 100%. Done this way. So to really lay credence to the power of this medium, and so I think Kate has done a phenomenal job, and such a hard story to tell.
It is, absolutely it is. Another category that I think this fits into is like labor literature, in how very similar to The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, and then even Grapes of Wrath, right? Like how you have so few economic opportunities and what that pushes you towards. There's a big theme here. The Jungle is a meatpacking plant. Here's the oil sands. You even
think of Death of a Salesman. The whole idea of where he says a man is a man, he's not a piece of fruit. You don't take the peel it and throw it away. That sort of that idea of labor, of this the human aspect, the human capital being placed so low. Because they know that someone else, and it's said several times in the book, lots of people who push back against Kate in the book itself say, you better keep your head down, you better shut your mouth, because they've got someone else who will have your job in a heartbeat. They'd love to be here. So don't make waves.
You are replaceable.
And you hear that sort of story from lots of industries. Basically it exists in some way in every part of the market, in every part of the world, but it was right on its sleeve on this one. So the labor issues that it talks about are pretty wide reaching.
I think the timing of this book too is worth mentioning. Like there is some controversy happening as this book was released around a lack of employees in our province. And it sounds like that's something that's happening everywhere, that a lot of employers are saying, oh, nobody wants to work anymore. When you have eyewitness testimony about what goes on up there,
what your conditions
are, very accessible to home, and people totally talk. I don't work in that industry, but I've heard these stories. I've heard a lot of these stories before about how terrible that lifestyle is working in the oil sands. And a lot of guys dropped out, went to work up there. A lot of guys got an education and went up there. But I forget where I was going with this.
Just what it does to people.
I totally lost my train of thought.
That's fine. It's okay to lose your train of thought. Just the idea of labor and what it does. When they, the way that a lot of industries, a lot of employers have been saying that no one wants to work anymore.
Right.
The pushback has been, look at how it works. Look at your conditions. Look at your and it's not just about pay. Everyone wants to make it about pay. The employer certainly wants to make it about pay. But they always will not want to address culture and conditions and eating people up and spitting them out.
So as this book is coming out, nobody wants to go work in the oil sands in Alberta. It's guys our age that now have families, and working in the oil sands is going to mean you're going to be spending a ton of time away from your family. And a lot of guys now I say guys, but everybody, um, working up there, recognizing, hey, I'm going to be away from my family. I don't want to be spending that much time up there. It's not good for my fam. So now those employers that are trying to extract oil from up there are saying, yeah, like nobody wants to work here anymore. So rather than improving the conditions that are found in up north, the government moved to open up and expand the temporary foreign worker program here in Alberta, which, if you've read my comic Ganky, you will know I have a lot of issues with the temporary foreign worker program, and it is poverty exploitation.
Yeah, and arguably you could say that it was almost a solution looking for a problem, that the government was you could make the argument, and I might be one of those people who would make the argument that the government was simply looking for an excuse to expand that program and having industry line up,
right?
With their handouts saying, well, how are we supposed to help? How are we supposed to pay you these royalties? How are we supposed to do those things if nobody wants to work and none of your people want to work? So what are you going to do for us? Gave them the out to say, well, great, we'd love to make it more than 10% of your workers can be temporary foreign workers, because a lot of this discourse that's happening right now will disappear when we bring in the population that's more easily exploitable, that's more vulnerable, that as soon as you start to tack on those things where their employment is part of the prerequisite for them being in the country, and sometimes being out of their country, which might have been dangerous for them in its own ways. Say they might be, fleeing persecution, fleeing civil unrest or government reprisals against people who might speak up there. They come here and they find that same thing pounded into them. Don't make waves, don't talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And fearing deportation. And stuff like that has happened in our province. Like we had the meatpacking plant. Oh, meatpacking came up again. We have the meatpacking plant in Brooks. There's an awesome little documentary on Amazon. I think it's even called Brooks. And it's this exact same situation that happened. You had a bunch of people that were working in this meatpacking plant, not happy with the conditions there, and people that are living in Alberta. And they're saying, we're not going to work there anymore. So instead of improving things, let's expand the temporary foreign worker program, bring in people from all over the world and recruit from all over the world. But the conditions haven't improved. You might be paying the same, but the conditions haven't improved at all. And then these folks that come from abroad are starting to unionize. And when they're unionizing, you got newspapers that are making some pretty awful remarks about the people that are trying to unionize and protest. And I think we're going to see some of that again here. So the timing of this movement to expand the temporary foreign worker program in Alberta, I think happened like the week that this thing was published, which was so interesting to watch and see that contrast.
You're seeing it in real time almost.
Absolutely. Yeah. She visited Alberta. She spent time in Alberta in 2008. We're still dealing with the consequences of that and what continues.
Yeah, that era and that thinking around it.
I would say that's the only party that comes out of this completely tarred and feathered is the corporations that are engaging in these conditions. Like, she's almost sympathetic, I would say, well, I wouldn't say sympathetic, but just overall sympathetic to the men up north who are behaving the way that they are because of mental health and isolation and all that stuff.
Who are also
she doesn't make excuses for the corporation.
She does make it clear that she understands that everyone is in a tough situation up there. It's not life as usual up there. It doesn't exist, especially if you live on camp. And that's when you see the conditions get worse for her, and seeing more things is when you are in camp.
Yeah, and she goes to some camps that are incredibly isolated, and it's acknowledged by all the characters in the book. So that's another crafty thing. She could have just put it in one panel and said, hey, this place is super isolated. But she really captures the culture of such a place through the characters that show up and just sort of bounce into her life. So well done. So
Yeah,
well done.
absolutely.
Want to go
Yeah,
to another
let's
question?
jump to the
Let's
next
pull
one.
another one. Does the subject matter in ducks have the potential to impact Alberta industry and government policy? Definitely relates to what we were just talking about. No.
Yeah,
I want to think that it would, but
this is the big downer question.
yeah, it is a downer question. I don't know. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair changed shit. It changed shit for people, and yeah, we could say that a lot of the protections that we have now are as a result of people starting to talk about conditions in labor at that time. But I just don't see that happening here.
Yeah, because moving anything in society, it's like moving a huge steamer ship, right? Like it moves very slowly. And if somebody grabs the wheel at some point and swings it back, it goes back into position. So it's a very slow process. And when you look at the history of this province, and we've done that in our previous videos, that especially when we were talking about the Stuart Cameron stuff, looking at the Social Credit Party in Alberta from the 1930s, mid 1930s, exactly the way things are now, right down to the government running their own propaganda arm.
Yeah.
When you look at our weekly premier radio show, call-in radio show, and then also the Canadian Energy Centre, which runs as a propaganda arm for the oil and gas
with a zero accountability
industry
to its people, which is so whack.
That ship, there's a pretty solid iron hand on that wheel right now.
Yeah.
So I say that ultimately and very sadly and unfortunately, I don't think a lot of long-term changes will happen for this. But what it does do is it brings on another premium work, like this pinnacle in storytelling that hopefully keeps the conversation happening. Because it's going to take the conversation reaching people who aren't just in the Fort Mac environment. So it takes this book hitting and being picked up and being shared by as many people as possible to as many people as possible to keep that conversation up, so that people, it takes us then writing letters to our MLA or MP, or even to our city councilors, just speaking as much as possible and keeping that discourse happening, because it's very easy. And we saw the same thing happen, arguably, with, say, like the Me Too movement, where it had a flurry of activity, and then it dies down a certain amount, and then it becomes part of the wallpaper, and not as much happens as should. Same thing happened with, say, the Idle No More, and talks about around Indigenous issues. The fervor was up, and lots of discussion, and then it started going back to Indigenous communities mostly trying to keep up the word, but in society at large, it kind of went down to being a part of the wallpaper.
I'm so curious as to what the Energy Center has to say about this book, and if Kate, I don't know if you could do like a follow-up to this or something, like an essay about like what are the consequences for you in publishing this book, getting this book out there, because I imagine you probably ran into opposition. But maybe that's just strictly from my understanding of the world around me, because I'm surrounded by it, right? Like my neighbors have those stickers on their cars of like, I love Alberta Oil and Gas, and don't you dare question this, because if you do, you're a traitor. And I wonder if Kate Beaton experienced some of that. If there was some kind of opposition, or if people tried to discredit her online, even some of the people in this book that she's gotten here, if they were trying to discredit her, I imagine some of those companies would be pretty active in trying to suppress this from coming out.
Yeah, or get out ahead of it with a PR kind of thing.
Yeah.
They love to come out and say, oh, we've made great strides since then. We sure have, here the things, things are much different than they were in that era that was under someone else's hand.
Yeah.
You see that quite often.
And I got to recognize too, like living in the shadow of the oil and gas industry for the majority of my life, It's like I just have that attitude of defeat. So of course my answer to this question is going to be like, no.
It's easy for us
There's
to
no
be
chance.
it's easy for us to be very jaded and
Yeah,
very cynical
yeah.
because we are so like we're soaking in that tub.
Yeah, we're in.
So it's all around us at all times. I'm and it does have, to speak to that even further, it does have that possibility of that it becomes this us versus them, this East versus West even sort of thing, where people say in Eastern Canada may receive this more, but it becomes these opposite, diametrically opposed echo chambers.
Yeah,
which we often find in Canada,
which happens.
where the West and the prairies, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan, I'd say most of all, becomes this echo chamber of rah 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 getting behind industry, and then outside of that, it becomes this echo chamber of boy, bad stuff is happening there, and it becomes this shell that doesn't get, both become shells that don't become penetrated by the other, don't become influenced by the other. It's two binary star systems that are, their gravity is enough to keep them apart.
Totally. And it's just as a result of the massive geography of this country. Like, it's really difficult to compare the experiences of somebody on the East Coast to the West Coast.
Yeah.
Even though we share the same government.
And you look at how
that we don't have a whole lot, right?
Yeah, and that spread of geography is just as wide when it comes to the differences in opinions and attitudes between, and the culture between these disparate areas as well. That rift in geography is reflected in the actual culture side.
Yeah. Oh wow! Like, for us to get to that place of sort of regionalism in Canada by way of this book is really cool. Makes me really appreciate this book.
Yeah.
And the interaction of those different regions of Canada with this piece of wealth, this nugget of wealth in our country, and just how we all respond to it, and those of us who are living in the pocket of that wealth. How do we cope with this as well?
And this book does a really good job actually addressing some of the regional ways. Where it's, it talks about, it shows her time out east and at the ocean, and the differences in not only setting and environment as well as the sort of attitudes and everything else, but then actually pushes back against that at some point too, where I think it's Dougie who says to her, this is no different than how I have had to live my whole life. Before this, it was me working for the fisheries as a hired gun. And then it was working for the mining as a hired gun. I've always had to live like it has been this, but it's been me over there, then that's over there, powerful. Then over there.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful.
And so for it to kind of break some of that ideas of every region being so different from each other, that character very specifically kind of spoke to smash that and say, no, this exists everywhere. You may not have seen it before, but I've seen it in my whole life. And it is, it's a fellow that's up in his 50s now, I think it is in the book.
What a prize. What a prize she's given us with that sort of that labor narrative that just gets lost in privilege, right? Like, what a great thing to
because when you look at how Canada has grown into what it's evolved towards, it's kind of been almost to ignore the fact that this sort of thing exists. The urbanization, it means everybody moves into a larger center, and then all of that dirty work gets shunted further and further away from the eyes of the larger part of the population. And that's happening everywhere. That's not just a Canadian thing. That's happening. Urbanization, the urban versus rural thing is it's at the fore right now in Alberta. The whole idea of urban versus rural is really like
crazy
at a height right now. At that happens cyclically. And it's just that's what happens is, and it's the same arguments that people make about things like electric vehicles, is that you may think your electric vehicle is clean because all you do is you drive it into your driveway and plug it into the wall, and that's all very clean and very nice. But you forget the lithium extraction and the oil and gas that still needs to occur for all the different things, and all of the manufacturing and how those are happening from areas that are like even bigger with poverty, or are contested areas or war-torn areas, and all that stuff is it's made to be put out of sight, out of mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the that's an argument that's made for the electric vehicle industry, is that it just takes all that dirtiness and it makes you think it doesn't exist because it's not in front of you all the time.
And when you go to criticize or even talk about it, usually it's on the premise of exactly what you're talking about, right? Like, oh, you're from the city, or you're from out east, or whatever. You don't have any skin in this game, so you don't deserve to talk about this. But I think we do have a skin in the game. We absolutely have a skin in the game, especially when we talk about things like temporary foreign worker programs, that sort of poverty exploitation stuff. I think we have a responsibility,
because that stuff comes around. That it hits you eventually.
Absolutely.
You might be shielded from this stuff initially, but everything is connected.
Absolutely.
So what goes around comes around eventually. It might take longer, but it'll get you.
Yeah. And KATE Beaton is getting into this. Absolutely is getting into this with some of that regionalism here, and the labor narratives. I think there's just forces that are bigger than Drawn and Quarterly that would suppress this impacting policy. But again, very jaded kind of perspective on this, and maybe it is younger people that are going to be reading Ducks and being like, no, this is bullshit, this is all wrong, and we're going to make some changes.
And I think having something that is something that is visible and that people are discussing, there's no downside to having more knowledge.
Never.
And seeing more perspectives. So
I hope
we
hope
so
it changes things.
It's easy.
We
to
know
be
not to get our hopes up too much. Let's move on to another question.
For sure.
Does Ducks leave you with any lingering questions or scenes that stuck with you?
This is a hard one to talk about, I think, because lingering questions, not so much. When I think about scenes that stick with me, this is where we get to the real dark places. I mean, there were times reading this where I felt physically ill. I felt sick, like I might throw up. I was upset by it. For me in particular, the scene that sticks with me, and once again, trigger warnings for all, like we talked about before, I'm openly discussing sexual abuse here, sexual assault. You hear the stories, but you very rarely see something visually when you talk about the idea of disassociating when a traumatic event, and when we're talking like the big T traumas, like sexual assault happening. You hear about that, but to see it in a visual medium. So there's a scene where Kate is being sexually assaulted, and she fully disassociates from her body and leaves and finds herself standing at the sea. And to see that, and that talks to the power of this medium, the power of the visual and graphic storytelling, that to see that, I immediately had a visceral physical reaction to it. I was on the edge of crying, and I felt like that knot in my stomach through it. And it was very, very powerful and like gut-wrenching. And that stuck, and that has stuck with me since I read and saw that bit. That stuck with me ever since, because I've heard people tell me the stories of disassociating, but to see it visually was really powerful.
I think good literature is a work of empathy, and when you hear Charles talk about that, like having an actual like guttural experience with it, like just gives it so much more credibility and just makes the work so much more powerful, not just in context with sexual assault, but this whole experience overall, right? And for Kate to feel okay enough to be able to share that with us, again, I think it's just a gift that she has given us. I guess, like, for me with that, I feel like I'm a little bit desensitized to it in a way, just having heard those stories growing up. And it's like, yeah, you know what? That's not surprising to me. Like, I've heard about that. And even, yeah, just you hear shit,
And
shit.
And your own vocation that you have in
I'm in
social
social work too. So
you're exposed
and I
even
should
more.
mention that other book. We just mentioned it in a haul video. Our Little Secret. I can't remember the author's name offhand.
Emily Carrington.
Yeah, so that book right next to this book, I read both those books in the same week. So
that's heavy.
Holy shit,
that's
right?
Heavy.
Like, and if you're not familiar with that book, definitely give it a read, because that author, it's taking what happened in that one page of Kate Beaton's Ducks and has expanded it to a whole graphic novel. And man alive, it is a kick in the gut. But again, like, I think we're just so privileged to have these things laid out for us the way that they are, because it is an exercise in empathy and pulls us closer to Kate or Emily. So yeah, I just think we're really privileged. But my surprise, I guess, just building off of that, or lingering questions that I have about this, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the surprise that I had, is the extent of the mail order brides up there.
Yes.
I didn't know about that piece up there.
I had heard about that.
Yeah. It makes sense to me. And I don't know if it makes sense to me by way of how Kate's explained it, but you got people who are living in extreme isolation with a lot of money. And that always explained to me the pervasiveness of addiction up north, because we always hear about that. But yeah, it makes sense. You got a lot of money, you got nothing to do, you're really isolated, you're super lonely. That would be a way to do it. And coming from that background that I'm coming from, like with working in social work, like one role I was in was working very closely with youth who were being sexually exploited. And I do take that pretty seriously. Like, we're trying to get girls off the street that are being exploited by older men. And Kate doesn't necessarily say that these girls are underage, but I have heard of that in that whole bride trafficking piece, right? That if somebody's importing a wife or going elsewhere to meet a wife, oftentimes it's somebody who's underage. And here in Alberta, we have some pretty strict laws around this stuff. Like, we have legislation that was very cutting edge legislation when it came out, our PSECA legislation, which looks at its Protection for Children, Sexually Exploited Children's Act, which was the first of its kind in the world. And so we tend to take that pretty seriously here, but apparently not seriously enough. Like, the fact that this is happening up there to that extent that Kate felt it merited mention in her book. Wow, I'm really curious about that piece, and how often does that happen here? I'm really curious about that, because not only is there's that one chapter in here where she goes to Victoria for a year, right? And it acts as a contrast to her experience in the oil sands.
Yeah.
But she's experiencing a significant amount of loneliness there as well. And even as we started off this conversation, talking about that experience of living in these parts can be incredibly isolating because of the weather. And I can recall when I was a young man and selling magazine subscriptions door to door in BC and coming across guys, and they're meeting these young men who are selling magazines door to door. They're giving us advice on women. And this is one of the pieces of advice that I'd heard at that time. And I didn't really think much of it. I was like, mail order brides, walking away from it. But this book has caused me to reflect heavily. Some other little pieces are causing me to reflect on it a bit, but I think that deserves exploration. Like, how much of a part does Canada play in that sort of trading of wives, and how much of that is poverty exploitation and sexual exploitation?
Yeah, borderlines on human trafficking.
Yeah, I don't know. There's something weird about it. It does not sit right.
Yeah. It's one of those things that it stinks.
Yeah,
right?
it stinks. I didn't know about that happening up there, but it makes total sense.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it's not solely just that. You see a lot of like professionals who might make a lot of money but not have a lot of opportunity to meet people. It's a pervasive thing that goes through a lot of that. So it seems strange to be something in Canada, but it exists.
Yeah. Weird stuff. Yeah. Lingering questions for sure. All right. I think this is the last question that we have. Yeah. And this is a good question. Does Ducks make any statement on Canadian culture or society beyond the bounds of the Alberta Oil Sands? What do you think, buddy?
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, definitely.
As we've been talking.
Definitely. Yeah. Now, even though it's centered around her time in the Alberta Oil Sands, like you just said, it drew parallels between time and Victoria, working in an art gallery at that time. That those same feelings can pervade. That this stuff sort of is everywhere. And like I was saying earlier with the character of Doug saying that, hey, the way that you're kind of a hired gun, almost exploited worker everywhere you go, that's a commonality anywhere you go as well. So it talks about a lot of different things and different facets of the sort of Canadian experience and existing outside the bounds of Alberta. It's such a concentrated thing. That's the thing about the oil sands. It's its own almost little fiefdom. Right? It's almost like it's a little kingdom.
Very much so.
Very much like you're basically, you go through the gates and it closes behind you and you're in there, boyo. You are stuck in there.
Husky right now. Yeah.
And so it just becomes this almost, it's very much like being in an institution or being in a prison almost, where it becomes like the way that law exists and the way that law and order and society exists is different within the bounds of this closed off system.
Yeah.
It's almost like a Stanford prison experiment, where placed within a very confined and controlled thing like that, everything changes. And the way that even people look at things can be morphed, can be poisoned in a way to where power dynamics get amplified.
Ooh.
Yeah. And as we've seen from a lot of discussions happen over the last many years, is that happens all over the place. Look at the power dynamic. Think about the Harvey Weinstein case in Hollywood and other producers. The power dynamics become spikes, go from ridges to mountains and valleys, right? Those things get amplified, and that happens all over the place. It can happen even within specific, just individual workplaces. Bad culture in a single workplace can make those dynamics go haywire. So Kate was smart to and was exposed to the way that people spoke and her experiences to recognize some of these things and talk about them in the book, that these things exist outside the bounds. It's just, this happens to be like a petri dish that you can put right under the microscope and really examine. And that's what this book does so well.
Yeah. As you were talking about that, it occurred to me that you could categorize this even as like a migration testimony, right? Your migration narrative. And really, like, Kate's experience of coming to Alberta is not a whole lot different from people coming from wherever in the world, on the other side of the planet, coming here. Not just in terms of the isolation, but in terms of the promise that you're pursuing, and that, again, that hope piece. You hope that life is going to be better when you get there, but holy hell, this is not what I expected. Kind of
whether you're sold a false bill of goods. The
I
promise that doesn't really deliver.
Yeah. And I've heard a lot of people say that about coming to Canada, that it doesn't deliver on the promises. And then you hear other things, people saying, oh, the American dream is alive and it's in Canada. Like, if you want to have that sort of social climbing, it's going to happen in Canada. But I don't know. Like, with stories like Kate's and stories like I hear from people all over the planet, coming to Canada is not what it was cracked up to be.
Well, and
it's cold.
It's a good lesson in that story is not a universal one.
Yeah.
The story of arriving somewhere and achieving the dreams and the promise is not a universal truth. The way that it's often portrayed to people.
And it has to be, I guess, like, of course it has to be portrayed in such a way that money falls from the sky.
I mean, if you're trying to push immigration numbers and you're trying to push, depending on what you're trying to push, you have to sell it as a universal thing. It doesn't make it right. I'd say even our education systems are that way. The amount of international learners that come to Canada and then find themselves in a tough situation and then suddenly saddle with debt for the education. Not all of them are. Some of them are coming out and saying this is great and I was able to prosper, and some are doing very badly and then trying to figure out how to make it in this new land that they don't know anybody in. Mm-hmm. So it's for it to be, these things to be sold as this universal truth that you come to Canada and everything is peachy and hunky-dory is it's a dangerous line to tread.
Yeah. So, statement on Canadian culture overall, I don't know. Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. Well, one thing I found to be powerful in that way was when near the end of the book, Kate is talking to her sister, Becky, I believe it is. I think it's Becky she was talking to. And she says, and they're telling each other about the experience. So she's telling her sister about being sexually assaulted and raped in the oil sands. And her sister breaks down and says, I always thought that being the older sister, so this might not have been Becky, because I think Becky is a younger sister. Sorry if I'm getting that wrong. Her sister says to her, oh my God, I always thought that being the older one, I'd go out into the world and I would take the hits for all the rest of you. And then shares with Kate that she had been sexually assaulted. And so it brings together that whole idea of that, oh no, this exists everywhere. And I mean, we live in a reality where the actual stat is that 50% of the female population will experience some sort of sexual assault in their lifetime.
Yeah.
50%.
I think it's even higher than that.
Which is, yes. And I mean, and then you look at the stats in terms of what's reported and things like that's extreme. That's scary. And that's a thing that for you and me as a couple of big, tall white guys, we don't experience, and we have to recognize our own privilege on that. But when you look at that, and when you talk to any woman about what they have to do to what they put up with, number one, in terms of not feeling safe in certain situations, and what they have to do to make sure that they are safe in situations, is insane to us, because it's the sort of things that we doesn't even enter our sphere. So I think that's one thing it does, is it makes a statement in the end that this is a common thing that happens to all women in all walks of life, everywhere they go.
Right.
And that's something that I think is important to be brought up as often as possible, because people don't get it.
Yeah.
Anybody it's the same thing where nothing is real to you until it comes home, right? So until you yourself or someone experiences this sort of thing, it doesn't always become real for you. That's why it has to be discussed as much as possible, so that people understand that, no, this is happening everywhere. It's happening, and it is happening to people even if you don't know it. So I think that's a big thing.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Um, yeah, I'm just as we sort of wind down the conversation here about this book, just trying to I'm trying to place it in context with themes in Canadian lit, and there's definitely some themes here that are present in like Atwood and Cohen. And,
Yeah, I would mention Atwood for sure.
Yeah, like big time, right? So sexuality, it's explored a lot in here. Like, how do you meet people? How do you do this when you're super isolated? And probably explains why people are doing it with people they shouldn't be doing it with. And so she's exploring that significantly. Certainly the climate and survival. Like, survival is always a big theme in Canadian lit. I mean, this is that full-on survival story. Beyond that, multiculturalism is a piece that comes up, especially in like contemporary Canadian lit. That's on display here as well, and diversity within the country and beyond the country too, which is absolutely beautiful. So yeah, she talking about Canadian culture, most definitely she's talking about Canadian culture, but yeah, I think it fits in a long line of really classic Canadian graphic lit as well. Like, even the artwork by itself, to me, harkens back to some of that Chester Brown and Julie Doucette as well. Kind of the classic Canadian cartoonists, at least in our modern time. She's sits very comfortably with those folks as well. So I think this is 2022, published in 2022, definitely worth mentioning as an instant classic.
Yeah, it's a seminal work that deserves to be held up next to the likes of Atwood and other of the huge Canadian authors.
Yeah,
it needs.
This is a treasure.
It should be held up next to those.
Yeah,
absolutely,
absolute treasure. Anything you want to comment on before we sort of call her?
We're talking about gatekeeping between prose and graphic works. I think this is the kind of book I want to see. I want to see this up for like a Giller or a Booker or the big Canadian, Canadian ones. I hope this opens those up further to non-strictly prose books.
Yeah,
I want to see everything blown wide open because of this
absolutely.
As well as the conversation on these things, on our labor practices, on our complicity between government, industry, and society. I want to see all that stuff blown wide open.
Absolutely,
it has the potential for it.
I think so. There's some good books coming out in line with that, like Between the Lines Publishing in Toronto, doing some cool stuff there, and just like more expressions of like labor struggles. Gord Hill talks about like 500 years of resistance in his stuff, and I think that's a present theme. It's just so good.
Yeah,
so good, so needed.
Yeah, I think Canada is at this potential turning point where we can really look at our country and have honest and open and brutal, frank discussions about where we should be headed and how we create better equity, better equality, better accessibility, better everything.
Absolutely.
So it's up to us to kind of try and drive that as a people.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I don't think I got anything else to say about this, but next month I think we're looking at Aaron Costain's Entropy from Secret Acres Publishing. So if you want to join us for that, we'll put out a date, probably in early January, put out a date for when we're going to be discussing that piece of work. Very cool graphic novel. I hope somebody picks it up because it does deserve praise, and its roots are firmly rooted in some cool themes that we'll get into. So I look forward to discussing that. And I'm so glad that you and I finally got to talk about this book.
I know,
man.
this was kind of like a burning ember inside me for a while, wanting to really talk about this thing. So I'm glad we finally got to do it. So yeah, I hope folks will join us for the next one. And if you have anything to add to these questions, hit us up, put some comments.
What did you think of ducks?
Yeah.
Like, let us know in the comments, or any of the themes that we talked about. Whether you're from abroad or from here in Alberta or somewhere in the rest of Canada, love to hear how your life is impacted by the tar sands, and good and bad. All of it's valid. All of it's absolutely valid.
Absolutely.
I want to hear it. So thanks so much, folks, for tuning in with us on our little experiment with live streaming. We'll definitely do more.
Great. Thanks, folks.
Bye. 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 Yeah. In the stream.